Here we go. Well, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Jim Hodson with the Fort Worth Aviation Museum. I'm here again with Gary. Obviously, we're not at the museum, and you can hear a train in the background. That's significant to what we're going to talk about. We're at Ryan Place Park, over here near TCU, on the south side of Fort Worth. There was a place here back in 1911 and 1915 and for up till the 1920s that was referred to as Ryan's Pasture. And this area was significant to Fort Worth and its aviation background because of what took place here in October of 1911 rather, and what took place later in 1915. In 1911, a gentleman named Cal Rodgers was attempting to do a cross-country flight. He was attempting to go from New York all the way to California. William Randolph Hearst had challenged anyone who could fly cross-country in 60 days or less that he would pay him $250,000. Well, in 1911, that was a fortune.
That's millions of dollars today.
It would be a good reward today. So a number of people started, and Cal Rodgers was one of them. He bought an airplane from the Wright brothers. In fact, he was the first civilian to buy an airplane from the Wright brothers. It was a Wright B flyer, and he, along with one of the mechanics from the Wright brothers, got on a train with his wife and some other people, and the train followed them along as he made his trip cross country. Now, there were no airports, there were no airways. There wasn't anything for them to guide them, so he followed train tracks. And that's why this park and Ryan's Pasture are near railroad tracks, and it became a place for people to fly in. So Cal Rodgers came into here and flew into here and was met by about 10,000 people. We're going to show you a plaque here that commemorates this, but the actual pasture was a couple of blocks over from here. So he flew in here, and he eventually did get to California, but he didn't receive the award because it took him over the allotted time. So neither he nor anyone else actually received the money. There were two people that completed. One, a Robert Fowler, who started on the West Coast, went east, and Cal Rodgers, who started east and went west. Now, there are a couple of stories about the only parts of the airplane that made it all the way from New York to California was the oil pan off of the engine. Everything else had gotten replaced. But that's what he had in the trains. He had workshops and things like that. So this was one of the first demonstrations, though, that aviation could be used to go cross country. And he was sponsored by a company called Vin Fiz, which
kind
of
like a 7-Up product.
Yeah, kind of like a 7-Up kind of a drink. In fact, he was doing some of the first aerial advertising as he would fly over some of the crowds. He had little cards that he would throw down to the cards, and that they could go to the grocery store and get free Vin Fizzes.
Early Amazon drone advertisement type deal. How it all began was Vin Fiz and box on a card out the airplane.
I'll show you a picture here in a second of what the pasture looked like, but there were no trees. There were no homes. It was simply a pasture.
All these trees are less than 100 years old.
Now, in 1915, another significant event in aviation history here in North Texas took place also in Ryan's Pasture. And this was the arrival of the 1st Aero Squadron, which was the first aviation squadron that the United States had. Now, keep in mind, this is 1915. The war has been going on in Europe for over a year. They've been well committed. When the war started, there were only 250 airplanes in the entire world. By the time the war ended, there were over 750,000.
750,000, almost a million.
But here, before we entered the war, we had 53 airplanes, and most of those had already crashed and were no longer useful.
Yeah.
Benjamin Falloy is considered to be the father of the Air Force. And at that point in time in 1915, the Air Force, we'll call it, the Aero Squadron, was part of the Signal Corps because their job was observation and spotting and liaison. Because of what was taking place in Mexico with Pancho Villa and the border incursions, the 1st Aero Squadron was ordered to move from San Diego to Fort Sill, Oklahoma, where they were mated up with their airplanes, worked with artillery batteries to learn to try to spot artillery spotting for them, and then they were ordered to San Antonio, to Fort Sam Houston, to be able to work on the border. Well, they came through here. This was the first time that this squadron had ever gone cross country. And so one of the places they came to was here in Fort Worth. They had been invited here by people like Amon Carter and Ben Keith, who were part of the Businessmen's Association, or what would have been considered the Chamber of Commerce. So ahead of time, Gary and I were talking about this earlier, there weren't any maps, there wasn't any way to really navigate. And so what the squadron did is the mechanics and the lead elements came with motorcycles and a brand new invention at that point in time, trucks. And they left Fort Sill, Oklahoma, and they headed out a couple of days ahead of time to kind of pathfind the route for the airplanes to come down here to Fort Worth, and then they also went to Waco before they got and Austin before they got to San Antonio.
No interstate highways, nothing, just dirt roads and a railroad track.
And so this spot was easy for people to find, Ryan's pasture, and so the entire United States Air Force landed here on November 20th, 1915. The entire one, the entire squadron, the entire Air Force, all 6 airplanes, landed here.
6 airplanes, the entire Air Force.
And they were considered JN4 Jennies. In fact, they had just gotten them. They were brand new. They'd been flying JN2s and JN3s, and now they had these brand new airplanes, which were JN4s, and they were going to be on their way down to Mexico with them. Well, when they got here, the citizenship of the town got here to meet them, and it was a huge deal. Mayor Davis, I think it was at that point in time, met them along with Ben Keith and Amon Carter. They wined them and dined them for a couple of days, which turned out to be a very good thing for them to have done.
Very good.
In a few years after that. But they were here, they got a chance to go around and see things and be here, and then they left 2 days later and headed down to Austin and then San Antonio. After that, they went to the border and to the punitive expedition to against Pancho Villa. This was the first use of the airplanes, technically, for military airplanes to be used in military service for the United States. And they were supposed to be out there to be liaisons and find Pancho Villa. Well, it didn't work that way.
No, because it's all desert.
So they had problems with the props cracking and the spars and the wood cracking and things like that. So they ended up with only a couple of airplanes that actually did anything for them. Now I want to go back to the trucks for just a second.
This is
trucks
amazing.
Are an interesting story.
Very interesting.
So these trucks left Fort Sill and went ahead, and they crossed a lot of rivers and a lot of bridges on their way down to San Antonio.
Oops.
Now these trucks were bigger and heavier than any horse-drawn vehicle at that point in time. So they made themselves known because every bridge they came across, they damaged to the point of them having to be replaced. So they destroyed every bridge they crossed on their way to San Antonio. And then after they got down to Mexico and the airplanes started failing, the one thing that they could use continually were the trucks. The trucks would work in the sandy soil. The trucks could go ahead and take supplies back and forth. So the trucks almost became more useful than the airplanes.
Yeah.
But when they landed here, Benjamin Falloy and his aviators and pilots landed here at Ryan's pasture, and the mayor at the time declared that Ryan's pasture would forever be known as Falloy's Landing. There's nothing to that point now.
Not quite forever.
No, if you go around the neighborhoods here, you don't find a Falloy Street, you don't find a Falloy's Landing Street. We do have a marker for the Vin Fiz that we're going to show you. But this is really kind of the birthplace in many respects of aviation in Fort North Texas and Fort Worth, other than First Flight Park, which took place just earlier in the year before Cal Rodgers came here.
I mean, it happened, and then just in October, January is when the first flight happened, and then just a couple months, obviously, 10 months later, you now have the Vin Fiz competition coming in. So things are starting to move fairly rapidly for Fort Worth. And with the Aero Squadron coming in, it's the first, because there was no second, third, fourth. The first Aero Squadron comes in here. Things are really starting to move now for Fort Worth and the North Texas area.
Well, and the war is going on in Europe, and we knew that at some point we were going to get into that war. As it turned out, when war was declared for the United States in 1917, Benny Keith was down in Austin, heard about it, came back and helped establish Camp Bowie here because of some things that had taken place. But then it was shortly after that that the notice went out that the Royal Flying Corps wanted to look for places here in Texas to be able to establish flying fields to train the Canadians. We had an arrangement with them that we would that they were training 300 of our pilots, and that the arrangement was that if they came down here, we would establish the flying fields. They would continue to train our pilots and mechanics. So everybody here in Texas wanted these bases. San Antonio wanted them, Dallas wanted them, Waco wanted them, Mineral Wells wanted them, of course Fort Worth wanted one. And Benny Keith went up to Washington, D.C. to meet with his good friend Benjamin Falloy.
And he had about Falloy, and we knew important.
We knew about Falloy. He was running the whole Air Force at that point in time. He gets to Washington, and Falloy says he's busy. He's getting ready to leave to go to Europe to establish flying operations there. So he takes out a cigarette paper and writes on this cigarette paper, "Do what you can to help this Texan," and hands it over to Colonel Cuthbert Hora, who was in charge of the Royal Flying Corps. Now, Cuthbert really wanted to do his operation down in San Antonio, but he was concerned that he wasn't going to have the manpower to do that. So he looked to Benny Keith, and when they came out and announced where the flying fields were going to be, they'd established all 3 of them here in Fort Worth.
You can't make this stuff up.
No.
On a cigarette paper. He writes on a cigarette paper, and we have all these fields in Fort Worth. Isn't that amazing?
3 of them. When everybody wanted one around here and they thought they should spread them out, they decided to have all 3 here. This was the only city, and again, the trains, we're close to the trains, and that's why it's partly here.
Gotta love trains. Planes, trains, and automobiles, right? Trucks.
So because of the relationship between Keith and Falloy, all 3 of them were established here. This was the only city in the United States that had 3 airfields, 3 functional airfields for training purposes that were right here. And then after we entered the war, the flying fields were turned over to us. But this was about the relationship between Keith and Falloy. And one of the things that Keith said after the fact is he said he had made more deals over dinner and drinks than he ever did across a desk. And so that was kind of the story here. Now Gary's got some things that took place with the first Aero Squadron after the First World War.
When we were doing the research for this, I thought it was fascinating, is that here comes the first Aero Squadron, and it's going to be basically what we call reconnaissance. It's going to be with the artillery guys and find the bad guys and everything else. This first Aero Squadron matures itself to where during the Vietnam War, so from 1915 to now late 60s, early 70s, they're now flying the SR-71 in the Vietnam War. So you go from a Jenny to an airplane that's doing 3 times the speed of sound, flying in the corner of space, to flying an SR-71, which I thought was fascinating. What a history. And then today, out of Beale Air Force Base in Northern California, I think is where it is, they're now operating drones in the same exact mission, which is reconnaissance. They're out there finding the bad guys so that we know where to go. Can you imagine if one of the pilots of the Jenny from the first Aero Squadron could have met and gotten in the cockpit of an SR-71? My gosh, that's incredible.
Well, there are stories. There's a book out there. It's called From Jennies to Jets, and it talks about some pilots who were learned to fly in the First World War, essentially flying kites. And then became the first commercial pilots to fly the Boeing 707. So they literally went from biplanes to jets during their career in that span.
In a person's lifetime, the change, the technological advances in a person's lifetime to go from biplane cloth supersonic. Unbelievable.
And a lot of that was here. Now I'm going to show you a picture, if I can do this well, what Ryan's pasture looked like at the time. I think if you can see this yellow one up here at the top, there were no trees. There were 10,000 people who showed up to see Galbraith, and that was the extent of what took place here. Now we're going to walk over and look at the Vin Fiz Memorial. See if we've got any questions. I'm just now getting a chance to see if there's any questions here. Gary's going to take the paper. Now this is all there is here in Fort Worth to commemorate these 2 really noteworthy events, especially
Historical.
from an aviation standpoint. And when you consider that Fort Worth has become a world leader in aviation and aerospace, this really is just kind of amazing. So we did a little commemoration here in 2010 for the 2011 for the centennial flight. And we're going to look at this memorial here. There's nothing here about the first Aero Squadron coming to town at all. See if I can do this without my hat getting in the way, so you can see the. Yeah, there you go. I think you can kind of read it there. So I'll give you a chance to just read what it says. And this was established in 1986 by the local people here. Gary's pointing at
October 17th, 1911, and they have the time, 4:15 p.m.
Now, there's also a story that Cal Rodgers, when he came here, he had been a number of different places before he came here. He came to Fort Worth, he went to Dallas, he came back here, he went up to Oklahoma City, and somewhere, either going or coming to Oklahoma City, he took a letter with him. And it's sometimes referred to as the first airmail letter. Of course,
Yes.
It wasn't airmail service at all, but it was considered an airmail delivery. So we're going to turn back around so you can see the park again. As Gary dances around behind me. So this small little park here in Fort Worth, the Ryan Place Park, is the only place that we have to commemorate some of the true beginnings of aviation here in Fort Worth. So we're kind of running up on our time here. And so if anybody's got any questions, I'm here where I can watch them now. I see we got Chris Willis is watching, and Bill, and I can't quite see your name. Bill's watching. We got a number of people who are watching today. So if anybody's got any questions, go ahead and ask them now. I guess we've done such a great job. But again, this was another one of our on-the-road videos here today, and we've got some other spots around Fort Worth that we're going to visit. And we encourage you to go ahead and look at our YouTube channel. We have over 60 videos of these that Gary and I have been doing here during the COVID. And we're going to continue to doing these as much as we can, but we'd like to be able to get out and do some of this kind of thing or visit other people.
I mean, imagine just the history of here's where the guys landed, and they start the relationship with the people in charge, and it builds up to where now we have 3 air bases here. Then it builds up even more, and then finally they put Carswell Air Force Base in there. They build the plant first, and then they build the Air Force Base part of it, and then we're having an F-16. We're having F-16s fly, and we now have that F-16. I mean, if you think about just the coincidences or the purposed management thereof of the assets and the land and everything else that's here in Fort Worth, it's amazing what we have. And they put the F-16 back to its original shape. So go from a Jenny to a fighter bomber that's out there now doing its job in multiple countries, and it kind of has its beginnings right here, where you see that's where the field would have been. In less than 100 years. I mean, this is incredible. In a person's lifetime, they did this.
Well, and then you figure too that Amon Carter was involved in this in 1915.
It's so incredible. Somebody has the vision to do this. The think outside the box. Boy, I'm going to say Amon and Benny Keith really thought outside the box. Literally. They were both looking to do things to improve the city and the community and things that they could do. But now think, when Amon actually started really getting involved with aviation, we went from 6 Jennies here in 1915 to in 1940 is when we opened the B-24s.
Consolidated plant and started building B-24s here. Amon Carter is the one who brought those here and made that happen. And then in 1951, he brought Bell Helicopter here. And so it was because of these small beginnings of biplanes and flying kites, and the fact that these people could see how interested the local public was, and they had the vision to see what it could do for the community in terms of economic development.
That's it, the economic development, because there's going to be a point in time where they're not going to bring cows in, because this was the place to bring your cows. That you have this tremendous economic impact in Fort Worth is unbelievable because of what's out there at Carswell now, and now they're building F-35s.
Yep.
It's just it's incredible, and all because a couple of people thought outside the box. So I highly recommend you, if you're a young audience listening, think outside the box. Please, we need you to.
Yes, we do. So I think we're going to go ahead and end it here. So from Ryan Place Park, near the landing of the Vin Fiz and the 1st Aero Squadron, it's Jim Hodson and Gary Goff with the Fort Worth Aviation Museum.
See ya.
Happy New Year, and we'll see you later in this week.